And I think I'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for taking the time to call in today to talk a little bit about the Futile Call Doctrine. My name is Rachel Zancanella, and I am the Division Engineer for the Arkansas River Basin with the Colorado Division of Water Resources. This discussion is to give some information and take some feedback about some changes to the way in which we administer futile calls in the basin. I feel like before we can really talk about what a futile call is, though, it's probably best to spend a little bit of time talking about how water rights are administered in general so that we can make sure everybody's on the same page for some discussion at the end of the call. Again, I'm the division engineer for the Arkansas Basin. My job, per the statute, is to administer and distribute the waters of the state based on the prior appropriation doctrine. And so what that means is that we allocate water to individual water rights within the system based on their seniority. In the system, that seniority is the prior appropriation doctrine, meaning those with the more senior water rights get water first, and then we fill it in junior appropriations as we go. That authority really comes from 3792-501 in the Colorado Revised Statutes. That is where essentially the statute states that the division engineer will administer the waters of the state, and they are able to curtail, so shut off, junior diversions if that diversion's water could have otherwise gone to satisfy a senior call. So we deliver water in priority to the seniorities, to the seniors. And we do that by curtailing junior water rights to make more water available to those downstream seniors. That same statute then goes on to say that unless the curtailment of that junior water right is going to not yield water to that downstream senior at the time and place of their need, then you can allow those junior upstream water rights to come back in. So an example of what that may have looked like when it was first being implemented in the 1880s is, let's say we take the Purgatory River, for example, down on the Trinidad side. There are junior water rights up in Trinidad who, if need be, would be curtailed to satisfy a downstream senior, which in a lot of cases in that particular system might be all the way down at the confluence near John Martin Reservoir. So in that particular case, if you were to call out those juniors to the satisfaction of the downstream senior, say he's calling today, so you curtail those junior rights today, but he doesn't need the water today, the downstream senior, he needs it. Sorry, let me back up. If you are doing that and you curtail the upstream junior today, that water in best case scenario might not be available to that downstream senior for 5 days when you take into consideration the travel time between Trinidad and John Martin. And so if that downstream senior doesn't actually need the water 5 days from now, he needs it today, you can let that junior water right back in so that they can make the best use of that water since it isn't going to get downstream to that senior at the time and place of his need. That's kind of the concept of what a futile call started from. And then over time, I think that kind of developed into, well, if it's going to take too long to get it to the downstream senior, or maybe the system goes dry between those 2 points, then your effort to deliver that water that you gained by curtailing the junior to satisfy that senior, well, that effort is futile. So it's a futile call. At any given time, the ability for a futile call to be determined has always been rested on the discretion of the division engineer. However, it was always supposed to be a situation where each and every time somebody asked to divert water out of priority under a futile call, they should have been in communication with the division engineer, with the water commissioner, making sure that the conditions exist for that ability to do that. But I think kind of over time, if it was considered futile once, it became considered futile always. And if it became considered futile always, then in a lot of cases, certain portions of the basin strictly went unadministered, in some cases for decades at a time. So if you fast forward in our history, when that original statute and that idea of a futile call really developed, we were only really administering water with respect to surface water rights. In the late 1920s, all the way up through the 50s, we started developing the technology for groundwater wells, and we started pumping the groundwater. In 1965, we started permitting groundwater wells, and in 1969, we had the Water Rights Administration and Determination Act, which directed the state and division engineers to integrate the administration of surface water and groundwater into one system on a basin-wide scale. At that point, we started recognizing that hydrologic connectivity between groundwater pumping and surface flows, we recognized ourselves that wells pumping, especially high capacity wells, were having an impact on the flows available in the stream to the senior water rights. The wells were specifically junior to those senior rights. This was also something specifically in the Arkansas Basin that became very well known and understood by the state of Kansas. And we ended up in an interstate lawsuit in 1985 that propagated a series of rules for the use and measurement of groundwater here in the Arkansas. So we continue to administer that. Our ability to administer groundwater and surface water is highly integrated. We use groundwater models, and we look at the timing of the impacts of groundwater use with surface water use. But all the while we've been developing that network, that system, that science and understanding of the connection between surface water and groundwater, these futile calls have kind of continued to operate in a way that didn't really give any consideration to the connection between surface water and groundwater. Again, in a lot of cases, a futile call has been described as if the stream goes dry between the junior and the senior, then the junior gets to take water out of priority. The basis for that being the idea is to make the most beneficial use of water. As time has gone on, in areas of the statutes where the law isn't exactly direct, this being one of them, for example, it doesn't say anywhere in the statute that a futile call is when, the stream goes dry for a specific length. If it takes more than a specific amount of time to deliver water, then it should be allowed to let the juniors up. There's nothing to that effect. And so where there are places in the statute where there is some gray area, the state engineer, also vested through the statutes, has the authority to provide written instructions and orders to the division engineers on how to interpret and apply some of those more gray areas. So in 2015, after recognizing that change in time over the last century of integrating surface water and groundwater administration, a written order instruction from the state engineer was issued that described for our benefit the way in which we would handle futile call claims in water court, how we would make records for them in the diversion records, those kinds of things. And it told us to consider the underflow when making those kinds of determinations. So in Division 2 specifically, starting in 2018, our administration started working on a pond management program to handle some issues that we have in the basin with ponds that don't necessarily have a reason to be there. We've done a lot of communication and education trying to help people understand those concerns. And we've been working with individuals around the basin to try and resolve some of those issues. One of the things that kind of highlighted an issue for us was that when we would go, for example, address a series of technically illegal ponds, maybe at the head of a drainage, we'd ask those individuals to resolve their issues by finding a plan or a path forward, which now, today, there are opportunities for being allowed to continue to divert your water how you are diverting your water, say you're that pond, in a way that's protective of senior water rights. That is typically through a substitute water supply plan or a plan for augmentation, something to this sort that allows you to have a out of priority diversion, like a futile call or a pond, but allows you to continue those uses in a way that's protective of those seniors. So we started having conversations with like those pond owner type situations. And what we were finding is, they'd go to water court, they'd get a decree, or they'd ask for a decree, but it's a 2018 water right. In the Arkansas Basin, we have a very specific situation that's a little unique, even in the basin, it's in the state itself, in that the Arkansas is what's called an over-appropriated system, meaning that there are more people who want to take water than there's physical water available. So there isn't a time in our normal operations where you could go out today and divert a new water right and be able to put that water to beneficial use. You would be so junior. The senior water right that's asking for water in the Arkansas varies between 1860 and at most, the most junior we ever get in the Arkansas is about 1910. And that's been the case for 25 straight years, 26. We're headed into our 26th year of a call on the river 365 days of the year. So that really kind of sets the stage for the fact that when that 2018 water right for a new pond or new use comes into water court, we say, we appreciate you coming to water court. That's a good start, but you need to come back with a replacement plan or a plan for augmentation to be able to allow you to continue to divert your water out of priority in a way that's protective of the seniors. And so one of the things that we were running into are these situations where someone would say, well, that doesn't apply to us because there's a dry stretch of stream between our ponds and the downstream call. It's futile. And in some cases, it kind of begs the question, well, is that stretch of stream dry because you diverted the water out of priority upstream of it? And we end up in this dynamic where we have to start considering, are you actually futile? Do we need to look at this and we need to evaluate it? And so in 2023, in January of last year, the state engineer amended that original written instruction and order to provide even further guidance to the division engineers on how to evaluate those claims for a futile call determination. And so in that case, it said specifically that we need to look at the hydrologic connectivity between those out of priority junior diversions, whether ponds or diversions for irrigation or whatever they might be, and that downstream calling senior. And so last year, starting shortly thereafter, I had this order to be able to try and communicate to people what the expectation for those out of priority diversions would be. And I started going around the basin, speaking at water user meetings, at the roundtable, at the Conservancy District meetings, and generally communicating with the individuals in the basin through their water court applications and other ways in which we could identify them. Because like I said earlier on, in some cases, strictly some water rights may just have been unadministered and just not incorporated into the priority system because they've been in an area that was generally a dry reach between their rights and the system, and explaining to them that they need to look at the hydrologic connectivity. So what we find is that in a lot of areas in the basin, there is strictly a tributary that is alluvial, that water may disappear into the ground below a junior diverting right, but it doesn't leave the system. It actually just travels then on a different time step through the alluvium and will daylight downstream as an accretion to the river and becomes a part of the total flow in the stream that then provides the water that senior downstream water right might use. And so we started looking at that. We started having these conversations. It became apparent that we needed to have a broader conversation. So in February of this year, I sent letters to about 200 individuals around the basin that our office was able to identify could be impacted by this change in administration, and invited them to these public water user meetings. We wanted to make sure that anybody else who just happens to be interested in the conversation was welcome and available to come participate, because the point of this effort is to protect the senior water rights. And so the senior water rights, I feel like, have the opportunity to sit at the table and express their concerns, because in a lot of cases, it's those seniors that have been on the side of not getting their water rights honored in order to allow these futile calls to continue. So that's kind of the basis for what happened here. Again, these are out of priority diversions under a futile call. And so the idea is to work with individual users. If you are somebody who received a letter specifically after we've had the opportunity to communicate through these water user meetings and have this conversation, gain some feedback, our office would be reaching out to you directly with a follow-up to make sure that we can sit down and look at your water right one-on-one and evaluate the scale for which these water rights might be impacted. I think that it's helpful to kind of describe how different water rights might fall on this scale of evaluation, because there are certain cases in the basin where a water right might have had a decreed futile call, in which case the water court has come in and said, this is futile to the Arkansas. That is essentially set in law now as a result of that decree. We call it res judicata. So those are out there. They'd see no change. In the written instruction and order that the state engineer issued, it does describe the pathway if you wanted to prove by providing scientific evidence that there's a hydrologic disconnection between your out of priority diversion and the system. In some cases, that might look like a fault line or something to that effect, where the water doesn't actually continue down into the tributary system. There's an actual hydrologic disconnect. In other cases, we've seen a few that we've evaluated already that are interesting when you consider the underflow, because you might have, for example, a stream that has an 1867 water right and an 1861 water right, and the water in low flow conditions disappears between the two of them. In one particular case that we looked at, there happens to be a outcropping of the Dakota aquifer at that same location, and that probably in low flow conditions is the water going into the groundwater table, and it actually expresses then downstream at the Arkansas. I kind of call it the chutes and ladders version, because it's bypassing the stream through an alternate route, again, taking into consideration the underflow. But in that particular case, the place where that water daylights is in a location where the next downstream call is going to be 1884 all of the time, in which case that 1867 and 1861 sees no real change, because instead of being considered futile, they're now just being administered in priority because they're the next calling right. That's kind of unique, and that exists a little bit. We'll have to evaluate those on a one-by-one basis between the senior types of rights. And the other side of that might be if where it pops back up, there's an 1860 water right, for example, well, you're still in the situation of needing to replace to that downstream senior. I think the other side of that scale, where things probably are looking at needing to go into a replacement plan option, work through a substitute water supply plan or a decreed plan for augmentation, is going to be those ones that, they daylight above a senior regardless, or anything in this basin that was developed after 1949 is in a category of its own, because those are considered post-compact developments. And in the Arkansas Basin, we in 1949 signed a interstate agreement called a compact with the state of Kansas that has two primary articles that are really of importance with respect to administration. One is Article 3, and it talks about the fact that all water in the Arkansas Basin that is tributary to the Arkansas is subject to the compact, with exception of any water imported into the basin, say from the West Slope. And Article 4D, which says that the compact is not in any way meant to prevent the development of Colorado or Kansas water users, but that we essentially agreed to keep the river whole and not materially deplete the flows of the Arkansas at the state line. And so that kind of set the basis and the foundation for the idea of a replacement plan or a plan for augmentation, even before that really came into the law in the manner in which it's available today. But so that's kind of the cutoff points for that. So in the situation where you would end up in one of those boats where you need to start thinking about a replacement plan, we're trying to have these water user meetings to help people understand the issue, help people identify what category they fall into. Because like I said, some people may not be impacted. Some people may be out of priority a little more often than they used to be, but they can adjust to it. Many water rights all over the basin turn in and turn out as the call changes all the time. And then there might be other people who have kind of enjoyed that out of priority, unadministered nature of their water right for whatever period of time, and now would be looking at coming into compliance by going into a plan for augmentation. With those people, I want to emphasize the fact that these meetings are important, because especially where there are opportunities to work together, it makes more sense to address that type of issue with those in your area who are equally impacted. Because if you have the ability to, for example, participate in a blanket plan for augmentation, then it makes the impact less by combining resources, potentially sharing an engineer or an attorney that might be necessary for a plan for augmentation, or making opportunities for, again, continuing your diversions like you may have in the past, but taking a lesser hit. So for example, we have statutory avenues today that you can take advantage of, things where you do, for example, everybody reduces their irrigated land by, say, 10%, and you as a group goes together to the water court, aggregates the trade-off, if you will, of that. We call it the historic consumptive use, and then that water can be reallocated to your purposes. That makes it so you can kind of try and avoid kind of the traditional buy and dry type of situation, which is the kind of situation that would cause an individual water right that would be now out of priority to have to dry up their uses completely. It might be an avenue for them to be able to continue to operate into the future in a way that's still protective of the senior water rights. That's a lot to describe and to take in, so I'm going to pause there. I guess the only other thing I'd want to add to that is that, like I said, if you are an individual who received a letter from us inviting you specifically to this meeting because we know you're going to be impacted, we would want to work with you. If you're going to take the path of providing scientific evidence to demonstrate you're hydrologically disconnected, then we would hope to have that evidence in by the end of 2024 so we can evaluate that. If you're going to go the pathway of finding a plan for augmentation or starting a substitute water supply plan, those should probably be in by the end of this year as well, because, for example, a substitute water supply plan takes about 3 months to review and approve, in which case then you would be set up to continue operating starting in April of 2025. And if you're somebody who's not interested in working with us, doesn't want to go down either of those pathways, but you are an out of priority diversion, then you would actually see a change in that administration where we would be calling you out starting in March of 2025. So that's kind of the timeline and the idea for on-ramping to compliance. Like I said, we'd be working the summer with individuals. I'd be more than happy to come out to the regions. I'm doing these meetings regionally all across the basin right now, and obviously here online. But to come out to the regions and sit down and do a workshop with you, sit down and look at your specific water right individually and see if there's a, what pathway forward is your best option. So with that, I'm going to stop talking for a minute and open it up to questions. What can I answer for anybody who has questions? And feel free to drop them in the chat if you feel more comfortable with that. I'm happy to answer them that way too.
Rachel, Peter Udall here from the Navigators. How many futile calls are we talking about in the Arkansas Basin that will be impacted by this?
We were able to identify approximately about 200 individuals that was related to a little less than about 100 specific structures. So some of those individual water right structures, like a headgate, may have had multiple water users under it, shareholders under a ditch, for example. So we sent the letter to about 200 users that we were able to identify were certainly currently relying on a futile call. Any other questions? I think that it would be helpful maybe to note that there's also probably a fair number of springs within the basin, many of which that have decrees. And that has come up in a lot of conversations for people trying to understand, how those like stock springs, stock water type springs might come into play in this. I think there's been a misconception that stock springs that produce water at a rate of less than 15 gallons a minute are exempt from administration. And that's really not true. There are exemptions in the statutes for stock watering wells that produce less than 15 gallons a minute, in which case sometimes what we see people do is come in and ask for a decree for a spring on a piece of property that would otherwise qualify for an exempt stock well. And in that case, if what they're looking to do is just be able to continue to utilize that stock water for stock watering purposes, in a lot of cases, those are already basically like developed springs. They're developed spring wells is what you would call it. Situations where somebody's dug down, put in a spring box, piped it to a stock tank, that kind of thing, in which case they may just be eligible for a permit for stock wells. And then they get to continue to operate outside the system like they always have, because then they qualify for that exemption. But springs specifically are not exempt from Colorado water law administration. They are, tributary to the system. And so I just want to make it understood that that is something that we will probably be working with more individuals on a case-by-case basis who fall into that category, who we did not send letters to specifically because there's just a whole lot of them out there. And to just give you some context of what would that look like if you were to be administered, in cases where that water comes up out of the ground and bubbles out onto the surface for a little while and then disappears back into the stream or into the system, if you have a decree on that and you have livestock that come and drink from that, it's really not any different than if that was just a section of stream, right? Nobody's going to come and tell your cows to quit drinking, and we don't tell the deer to quit drinking. That's just part of the stream. What we do see is when people then come into water court and they ask for a decree for that spring, and now the big pond they built below it that has a dock and, you know, all of those kinds of things, then we're going to ask you to come back with a replacement plan, because you're causing a depletion out of the system that is out of priority, if that makes sense. Oh. Sorry, what did you say? Maybe that was a accidental comment. Does anybody have any other questions that we can answer about this issue? We have a whole bunch of information available on our website. It goes into more detail. The written instruction and order has a lot of detail and describes everything from the way we make diversion records through how we handle making absolute water rights that have historically diverted in the past, but maybe still conditional through the water court process. We've had a few questions about that. So if you're an individual in that boat, you know, this would be the year to work to perfect that water right while it's still being administered in the way that it had previously been. And then we would, again, shift starting in the spring of 2025. I get a lot of questions in person, but not so many online. So if you have other questions and you would feel more comfortable, you can reach out via email. You can talk to your water commissioners. We're happy to answer any questions that you have. But I don't have, unless there's any more questions that I can answer. My name is, again, Rachel Zancanella. My contact information is Rachel, RACHEL .Zancanella, ZANCANELLA @state.co.us. And I'll put that in the chat in case anybody wants to grab it. And you can reach out individually if you have further questions. If you are one of those individuals who received a letter from us, like I said, we'll be following up with that, inviting you to come to a workshop in your area so we can sit down and look at your water rights individually and help you figure out which way to move forward, what your options are.
Rachel, I have another question. Peter Udall, Navigators. Are you the one that's going to we'll be connecting with to assess our rights and infrastructure, or is it someone else that will be meeting with us?
You specifically are in District 10, and we just held our interviews today for a new water commissioner. You may have been familiar with Doug Hollister or Jacob Olson. They've moved on to new positions with the state, and Elizabeth Nosker, Beth, is on this call. She's the deputy in that area, so it'd probably be me and Beth sitting down with you until we get whoever we bring into that position up to speed. But yeah, we can reach out to you directly.
Thank you.
Hey, Rachel, this is Carlin Armstrong over at CPW. I have a quick question for you. It's really helpful to talk this through in this venue, and I know we're just still processing everything that you've shared today. Do you will a copy of this presentation be available, or do you have a summary of the reasoning and kind of the points that you went through available on the website, or where can we kind of digest this in another form?
Sure. Thanks, Carlin. I am recording this one, so it'll be available for you to review. We'll make it available online. There's a frequently asked questions document that we're currently working on. There's a pamphlet that's available already online. The written instruction and order is available online. There's a web page we set up on our website specifically for this topic, and I'll drop that in the chat too, because it's buried a little bit on the website, make it easier for you to find. But then, Carlin, especially, any individual types of questions, I am, as I'm working through these different water user meetings, collecting all of the questions that we are getting from the public, and compiling those so that we can specifically answer each of those questions in writing, and we'll make those available as soon as we are done with these public meetings. We have one more available virtually, and then I think 3 more in person. In Pueblo, Rocky Ford, and Colorado Springs coming up next. So the feedback that we get from people, those are the kind of things that we're trying to compile, because I know that this represents a change. And in some cases, this is, very challenging. There's a lot of obstacles to overcome for some people. So if you're willing to work with us, we're happy to work with you. We can work on timelines as necessary to be able to move in the right direction. Where we'd be looking at those curtailments is probably focused on anybody who really chooses not to participate in the process of working with us to come to some sort of plan that is still protective of the senior water rights. But I will link this here in the chat for you in just 1 second.
Awesome. Thank you.
Any other questions while I'm working on that? Sorry, I should have had that pulled up before we started. This is the main page, and then there is a drop down in the middle of the website that it says Arkansas River Basin Futile Call information, and under that drop down is a copy of that pamphlet information, as well as the written instruction and order from the state engineer.
What is the website?
It's DWR's main website, so dwr.colorado.gov. There's a chat box on the right-hand side of this video call that if you want to look at there, I just dropped the link to that website there. You can click on it, and that obviously goes a little bit past the main page of the website, but that is where specifically you can find more information on futile calls.
Thank you.
Sure thing. Okay, well, I really appreciate everybody's time. Like I said, please feel free to reach out directly. Oh, Matthew, do you have a question?
Oh, I don't know that it's a question. I just wanted to say thank you for explaining the change in policy. I appreciate that. I appreciate that it sounds like you're giving clients some time, because I have some folks that might be interested in solving the problem, but it's going to take a little bit of time. But at the same time, I also represent senior water rights on the bottom of the Arkansas River, and I think overall the change that you're implementing is beneficial for senior water rights. And that, I just want to say the water does seem like it's going to be put to use in the state of Colorado by people who need to use the water. And so I know that the Amity in particular is supportive of your efforts on the futile call, without speaking to any specific stream or administration scenario, just overall recognizing that the role that groundwater plays in supporting surface streams and that downstream seniors are using that water. We think that's important. So thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. I really appreciate the feedback. Thank you all again very much for your time, and let me know if you have any further questions. Have a good day.
Thank you.